Watchtower was the brainchild of Admiral King, who conceived the operation in early 1942. King saw that Tulagi would serve as an additional bastion to the America-Australia lifeline, the starting point for a drive up the line of the Solomon Islands into Rabaul, and a deterrent to any further expansion by the Japanese. On the 25th of June, Admiral King issued an alert notice to his Pacific commanders to prepare for offensive operations against the Santa Cruz Islands and Tulagi. Subsequently, a movement warning order was sent to the 2nd Marine Division, as it had already been determined that the reinforced 2nd Marine Regiment would be earmarked for the invasion of Santa Cruz. On the 30th, the regiment was detached from the 2nd Marine Division and assigned to the Amphibious Force South Pacific, commanded by Rear ADM, Richmond Kelly Turner. This force would be augmented by Green troops from the training base at Camp Elliott, outside San Diego, California. Some recently graduated boots were transferred from the newly formed 22nd Marines to bolster the component's 2nd and 10th Regiments. On the 10th of March, the artillerymen of the 10th Marines, with their 75mm pack howitzers and 155mm guns, had moved to Camp Dunlap at the tiny town of Nyland in Southern California. It was an ideal site for practicing cannonades under the hot sun, with the Chocolate Mountains as a backdrop. The locals didn't seem to mind the all-day firing, though pictures often fell off the walls of their modest wooden houses. Occasionally, a distant rumbling could be heard at night when the big guns went into a barrage of firing. By April, however, most of the regiment had returned to San Diego, and in just 2 months, on Wednesday, the 1st of July, they were aboard their transports, heading for the South Seas. The vessels that carried them later were called the Unholy Four. The President Adams, APA 19, held the 3rd Battalion, 2nd Marines, 3 halves. The President Hayes, APA 20, held the 2nd Battalion, 2nd Marines, 2 halves. The President Jackson, APA 18, held the 1st Battalion, 2nd Marines, 1 half, and Company G, 3rd Battalion, 10th Marines, G 310. The Crescent City, APA 21, held the Headquarters Company, 2nd Marines, HQ 2. The transports sailed in company with the cargo ship Alhena, aka 9, carrying HQ 310. All the vessels were overloaded with combat gear and armament. In addition to the infantry, each transport carried 1 battery of 75mm pack howitzers. On the Jackson, the 37mm anti-tank guns and baby howitzers were lashed on the aft deck. Slung from pulleys, cables, and large cranes, davits were the landing craft. Higgins boats, barges, and deck-mounted tank lighters, the flat-bottomed boats used to take their cargo to shore. PFC William J. Gilliman, G310, remembered, "There must have been close to 50 or 60 landing craft aboard, and all were capable of holding 30 or more men. The hatches were boarded over at each deck, and then we loaded everything we possessed. Amphibious tractors, trucks, jeeps, tanks, recon cars, guns, and anything else that could be piled on. We had a tremendous supply of ammunition down in the hole, most of the reserve ammunition for the whole regiment. The Jackson was crowded, jammed, odoriferous, and dirty." That first day of July 1942 was 68 degrees at 0800, hazy with a slight ocean breeze, as the green utility-clad Marines crowded the rails of the troop ships to take a last look at the beautiful port city of San Diego. Many hoped they would have the opportunity to see it again, thinking they might even relocate there once the war was over. Most had never seen the Pacific Ocean before, much less been a passenger on a transport, but they soon settled down as they watched their convoy, accompanied by the carrier Wasp and a destroyer screen. When the ships finally were at sea, the sealed orders were read to the men. "This is Task Force Number 18, headed south by southwest in the Pacific Ocean for aggressive action against the Japanese." "That hit us like a bolt," Gilliman recalled. "It was less than a month since the Battle of Midway, and most of the troops believed we were going to reinforce the Midway Island garrison." Holed up in the bowels of the hot and sticky transports, the Marines broke up the dull days by playing poker, many for the first and last time as the big city boys began to rake in money, mostly from the inexperienced and gullible. Yet what would they need money for where they were going, wherever that might be? The men were accustomed to Marine Corps cuisine, but now it was US Navy chow aboard the crowded rocking vessels, and most did not like what they were offered. On Saturday, the 4th of July, however, Ian's LP May, USNR, the ship's commissary officer, had a surprise for the troops on the President Hayes. Chief Commissary Steward H.W. Watson had prepared an Independence Day feast: tomato juice cocktail, sweet pickles, olives, celery hearts, Waldorf salad, roast tom turkey, oyster dressing, buttered peas, giblet gravy, mashed potatoes, asparagus tips, candied sweet potatoes, cranberry sauce, hot finger rolls with butter, apple pie, ice cream, coffee, and cigars and cigarettes. On the 10th of July, the 1st Marine Raider Battalion arrived at Noumea, the pleasant capital of the French oceanic colony of New Caledonia, from its recently conducted commando-style training in Samoa as a component of the 3rd Marine Brigade. The cigar-shaped island of New Caledonia lies about 900 miles from Sydney and Auckland and 700 miles from Suva, Fiji. It is known as La Grande Terre, the Great Land, and has been described as the most interesting place in the Pacific, laced by a 1,000-mile coral reef with an enormous lagoon at its doorstep. Although New Caledonia has a subtropical climate, there is little tropical growth beyond occasional clumps of bamboo and coconut palm. The dominating features are shingle streams flowing through greenish valleys and scattered farms flanked by steep, rugged hills. Sanitary conditions for the US troops on the island were poor, but it was free of malaria, dengue fever, and amoebic dysentery, including filariasis, which was prevalent in Samoa. Regardless, the sailors, soldiers, and Marines loved it. Noumea was unlike any town they had ever seen. Only a few locals spoke English, but the American dollar did a lot of talking by itself. In the Paris of the Pacific, you could pick up fresh baguettes at any local bakery, as well as Australian beer. According to Robert C. Muirkey of the 132nd Infantry, if you had any rank at all, you could once in a while wrangle a date with some French dolly. That is, if you beat the New Zealanders and the Australian officers to the action. But they were there first and had all the choice already staked out. The 1st Marine Raider Battalion, one of the 4 new elite Special Commando-type battalions, was under crusty Old Corps Colonel Merritt Austin Red Mike Edson, who had received his baptism in jungle fighting in Nicaragua. That experience and the familiarity with the Japanese that Edson had gained with the 4th Marines in China would be greatly to the Marines' advantage during the forthcoming operations on Tulagi and Guadalcanal. As soon as the raiders had reached New Caledonia, Edson put his men on a grueling training program, running and climbing through the rough terrain of the island's backcountry, where they set up a tent camp in the bush. The raiders loved the role and added bushcraft to their commando skills. The Navy Department had assigned a special code word, Belmont, to the 1st Raiders, the only Marine organization to have its own code name. The unit continued its arduous training in New Caledonia until late July. It was in an ideal geographic locale for the pending Solomon Islands operation. In the interim, a few raiders who obtained liberty sought out entertainment in Noumea, some simply staying around the water fountain at Place Curbed, perhaps to admire the few French ladies. The 3 movie houses in the town were not often places of choice, as they were small and hot and stuffy, and all the films were in French. The men had to go prepared to stand through the 2 verses of our national anthem and the Stars and Stripes, as well as the French Marseillaise, as an overture to the programme. A few religious servicemen may have attended services at the Catholic Cathedral or the Protestant Church on Sunday. One particular building in Noumea, a large pink house on a small hill, seemed to beckon to the Marines. It was the town's principal bordello, properly named La Maison Rose, the Pink House. The officers had their own entrance, but for the others, the lines were so long they were patrolled by the military police, and the US Army opened up a prophylactic station not far away. The bordello remained open for business through most of the war, though sometimes a well-meaning chaplain would cause its temporary closure. Generally, La Maison Rose operated with the tacit blessing of the Force Surgeon and the Navy Medical Department. The Force Medical Inspector later described it as maintaining a zero venereal fallout. On the 22nd of July 1942, 3 former British Solomon Islands Protectorate district officers with detailed information about the islands joined the first Marine raiders. Nick Waddell and Dick Horton, along with Henry Jocelyn, had been ordered from Sydney to Port Vila. They were cooling their heels in Vila at the request of Solomon Island Resident Commissioner Marchant, who believed they might return to their former posts in the Solomons. Waddell, having been released from Australian military service, and Horton, who had been denied permission to enlist in the Royal Navy, were held in Vila. Jocelyn had been there since March, bringing the Protectorate government records from Auki Maleta in the Ketch Combito. Marine Colonel Edson saw an opportunity to utilize the 3 men, who had detailed knowledge of Tulagi, the raiders' initial objective. Instead of idling in Vila, their expertise could serve as valuable guides, as they knew the 3.5-mile Tulagi Island thoroughly. Rear Admiral John S. Slew McCain, Commander Air, South Pacific, Comersapac, intervened to arrange with Sir Philip E. Mitchell, High Commissioner for the Western Pacific, to release the 3 for temporary service with the U.S. Marines. McCain also arranged a priority flight on a PBY from Vila to Noumea. Edson's raiders, as the men referred to themselves, departed from the Paris of the Pacific on July 27th without fanfare. They were distributed among the 4 fast transports, APDs, of Transport Division 12, Colquhoun, Gregory, APD 3, Little, APD 4, and McKean, APD 5, converted from World War I, vintage destroyers. The APDs reached the Koro Islands, Fiji, on July 28th to meet the Watchtower Task Force, which was arriving from New Zealand, San Diego, Hawaii, and Australia for pre-invasion landing exercises. While the raiders were in New Caledonia, the 2nd Marines convoy was en route to Tonga. Bill Cannon from Company C, 1st Battalion, 2nd Marine Regiment, described the voyage from San Diego. The trip over was almost unbearable with so little air to breathe. The intense heat almost pushed us to a breaking point. Everything was wet from perspiration and water was rationed. Seaplane James Sorensen, A-12, was aboard the President Jackson. Our quarters were on B deck, above the waterline and right under the main deck. It could be awfully hot in these steel-walled quarters. We had about 200 men in the compartment, sleeping in tiers of bunks, 4 high. All you could do in a bunk was roll over. If you lifted your head more than a few inches, you would scrape a layer of skin off your nose. The bunks were built up around 4 sides of a big hatch, which extended down to the hold of the ship. It didn't leave much room for movement in the compartment. We were up in the forward part of the ship, with the head right next to the compartment. At that, we were lucky because there weren't very many heads and washrooms for all the men aboard. We washed our clothes in the big sinks, the same ones we used to wash ourselves when there was water to wash. The head was a long metal trough with a pair of smooth-shaven boards laid over it. At intervals of a few minutes, salt water was supposed to flush out the entire trough. Sometimes it did, and sometimes it did not. The odour of sweating men became part of the ship. You could not get away from it. The ventilation system followed the example of everything else that wouldn't work aboard our scow. Chow became worse as the days went by. The 2nd Marines endured weeks on the stinking transports, with some men having only 15 weeks of boot training. They were physically exhausted from the long journey, as were all the Marines in the task force, especially those assigned to the ship's bowels. Officers who shared deck cabins were in better physical shape and had access to better food and conditions. The discomfort of the poorly ventilated and crowded transports ended when the 2nd Marine Regiment arrived in Tonga, known as Where Time Begins, or A Place Where Time Stood Still. Her Majesty Queen Salote Tubu, a Methodist monarch who ascended the throne in 1918, had been informed of the U.S. Marines' arrival, but not of their number. The missionaries and locals were astonished by the influx of Marines. The Marines, who had departed San Diego 17 days earlier, were apprehensive but relieved to be on solid ground. In the rural community of Tongatabu, Sacred Tonga, the Marines refueled and glimpsed island life. Natives sold them green coconut milk, which proved less enjoyable than anticipated. The capital, Nuku'alofa, City of Love, now hosted hundreds of American soldiers and around 4,000 U.S. Marines, along with soldiers from the U.S. Army's 147th Infantry Regiment and airmen from the USAAF's 67th Fighter Squadron. The Marines would soon leave, leaving behind U.S. Army personnel, some sailors, and a small group of New Zealanders from the 34th Battalion. On July 24th, the Marines boarded their transports once again, and the flotilla moved out to sea the following day. 2 days later, the convoy rendezvoused with Invasion Task Forces 11, 16, 18 and 62, roughly 370 miles south of the Fiji Islands. The next stop was the rugged Koro Islands of Fiji, which had characteristics similar to the target area, though fortunately the target area lacked a dangerous coral reef like Koro. Charles O. Hall of Company D, 2nd Medical Battalion, described the events. We were then told that we were to make a landing on Guadalcanal, Tulagi and Florida Island. A few days before the landing, we made a practice landing on Fiji. I later read this was the most fouled-up landing ever, and I believe it. We never did anything correct, as nobody knew where anybody was, and only small sections were together. There were no beachmasters, and the place where we landed was coral and full of holes. Many Marines drowned or nearly drowned during the mediocre landing. Our battalion ate fresh bananas, mangoes, and native chicken while on the beach. We returned to the Jackson, and I guess everybody else got aboard the correct ship. Then we sailed toward Guadalcanal. On the 30th of July, the convoy was at the Koro transport area. A staff conference held aboard the Crescent City revealed future commitments of the 2nd Marines in the Watchtower operation. The Apricot Plan to deny Ndeni and the Santa Cruz Islands to the Japanese was still in effect. Regimental Secret Operational Order 2, 42 specifically outlined that the 2nd Marines, reinforced, less the 1st Battalion, as the division reserve, was to be prepared to take over the mission assigned to either the 1st Marines or the 5th Marines, in the event that either or both units were unable to perform their assignments. The gyrenes in the average outfit could not be described as amphibious troops. Even though they were considered to be sea soldiers of the U.S. Navy, they simply did not have sufficient long-term training as a professional seaborne force. Nevertheless, the U.S. Marines were the best available for the task that lay ahead. On the 31st of July, combat teams B and C, less attached units aboard the President Hayes, of the 2nd Marines rehearsed in the Koro Islands by landing on make-believe enemy-held shores. The troops had participated in very limited practice in Higgins boat landings. On the 30th, the 3rd Battalion, 2nd Marines from the President Adams, was to disembark and hit Beach Green on the last day of the exercise. Then a change in orders arrived from the Crescent City to land the 3 halves at Rocky Nola Point on the 29th. But before this could transpire, new orders were received for the landing exercise to acquaint untested Marines with a ship-to-shore movement. The original landing date of the 30th was reinstated. The 3 halves boarded the Higgins boats and headed for the shore as directed. However, when the boats were a few thousand yards out, the Whitecaps breaking just ahead signalled trouble, and the 3 halves landing force turned around and returned to the Adams. Former Lieutenant Richard E. Benink, USNR, landing boat commander on the transport Haywood, AP-12, recalled, "As we approached the Koro Islands with the Marines, paratroops in the boats, I saw that its shore was ringed with a coral reef, black and sharp, like shark's teeth, that would have chewed our boats, plywood LCPs, to pieces. I returned to the ship without attempting to land. Fortunately, the other landing force officers did the same, or we would have had no boats for Guadalcanal." The practice landing in the Koro Islands proved to be a bust. The first U.S. Marine war-related landing exercise of moving men en masse from transports at sea to land indicated the Marines were not ready to storm the shores of an enemy-held area. Major General Alexander A. Vandergrift, commander of the 1st Marine Division, appraised the exercise. These rehearsals did not work out well, mainly because hidden coral prevented the boats from reaching the beaches, although I later described the rehearsal as a complete bust. At the very least, it got the boats off the transports and the men down the nets and away. It uncovered deficiencies such as defective boat engines in time to have them repaired, and gave both Turner and me a chance to take important corrective measures in other spheres. Meanwhile, CUB-13, a small U.S. Navy specialized air and base facility unit, was activated in 1942 on the West Coast, specifically for the Endenai operation. Personnel and supplies were taken from the recently formed Lion 1 facility, also on the West Coast. This large unit was formed in the United States as a complete naval base for Espiritu Santo Island, New Hebrides, codenamed Button. However, by drawing men and materiel from Lion 1, Cub-13 delayed the progress of Base Button. Supplies were requisitioned, but only limited quantities reached the advanced bases. Espiritu Santo, which was the closest location to the target area, was to be the major backup base for operations in the Southern Solomons, yet it lacked everything. Noumea, the advance headquarters for the South Pacific Command, was in no better shape. On a visit in late September 1942, General Henry H. Hap Arnold, head of the U.S. Army Air Forces, found that Admiral Gormley, the commander of the South Pacific area, had 80 ships in the harbour which he could not unload. Gormley's people didn't know what was on the ships. Consequently, the transports had to be sent down to New Zealand to be completely unloaded and new manifests made out. This when there was a distinct shortage of shipping in all other theatres of the world. The Navy had taken one hell of a beating and did not have a logistic setup efficient enough to ensure success. But Cub-13 drew the required materiel from the West Coast depots and was hurriedly shipped off to New Caledonia, reaching Noumea on the 1st of September. The unit was to occupy Ndeni and construct a backup base for Guadalcanal, but by the time it had reached Noumea, circumstances had changed. It was too late for the proposed base. Nevertheless, the operation remained on hold pending the outcome of Guadalcanal. Several plans were considered, including one, which was later cancelled, involving the Tonga-based 147th Infantry Regiment. CUB-13 was eventually dissolved and became part of the New Caledonia Naval Base. At 1750, on the 31st of July, the Watchtower invasion forces of 82 warships of Task Force 61 had departed the Coro Islands. The following day, plans were made for the select landing party for Ndeni, actually nearby Trevanion Island, Santa Cruz Islands, headed by Captain George F. Doyle, an engineering officer with the 2nd Pioneers. Included in the group were 6 Marines from the Intelligence Section, 2nd Marines, under Sergeant Jack T. Lent, Seapill Malin R. Cruz, and Sergeant Hawkins as the photographer. They were to land in the Santa Cruz Islands and make a reconnaissance to see if the area had the potential as a backup base for the Guadalcanal-Tulagi operation. On board the transport, the men drew maps of their destination, Trevanion Island. On the 2nd of August, Captain Doyle's recon party left the transports by destroyer for Port Vila on Efate Island, New Hebrides. There they boarded the McFarland, DD 237, where they were temporarily housed. On the 6th, the men were taken to Trevanion Island on one of the McFarland's motor launches, and the next 3 days were spent surveying and photographing potential sites and making maps. On the morning of the 11th, the McFarland sent a boat to pick up the party, with orders that they were to evacuate the island at once. 2 days later, she reached Segond Channel, Espiritu Santo Island, New Hebrides. Captain Doyle reported to Colonel Arthur, Colorado 2nd Marines, that the only good transport areas are at the head of Graciosa Bay, and only 3 or 4 transports can anchor there but require air protection. The estimated time to prepare and occupy this island upon arrival is about 3 weeks. It is my opinion Trevanion Island is too small to tactically accommodate a reinforced regiment and supplies. The occupation of Trevanion, however, would prevent the enemy from using the back door approach to recapture Guadalcanal. While Doyle's recon patrol was already in the Santa Cruz area, a mailgram from the commander of Task Force 62, dated the 5th of August, altered the involvement of the 2nd Marines in the Santa Cruz Islands. It read in part, "On August 7th, the 1st Marine Division, reinforced with the 2nd Marines, will recapture Tulagi and Guadalcanal Islands." In this first forward step toward clearing the Japanese out of a conquered territory, we have strong support from the Pacific Fleet and from the air, surface and submarine forces in the South Pacific and Australia. R.K. Turner, Rear Admiral, U.S. Navy Commanding. Jim Sorensen, aboard the Jackson, was a scout sniper with Company A, 2nd Marines. Company A noncoms had been summoned to a briefing session where their destination was made known to them. Sorensen recalled, "I never heard of Guadalcanal or Tulagi. Our unit was given very little information about Guadalcanal, since our initial assigned role was to take part in the assault on Tulagi. At this briefing we were given a reasonable description of the Tulagi terrain, and told that our role would be to land somewhere in the area of the harbour, following which we would have to scale precipitous cliffs or a steep ridgeline and gain the heights above the harbour. Later we learned that our mission had been changed, and we were now to make a landing on Florida Island." The first order of business for the 2nd Marines was to secure positions around the initial target area, the islands adjacent to Tulagi, Florida, Gavutu and Tanambogo. This accomplished, the lead team of the 2nd Marines was to head for Florida Island, codenamed Runabout. D-Day opened with an overcast sky of low cumulus clouds and a slight mist, a gift to the Allies, for it kept the enemy's Mavis flying boats moored at Gavutu, preventing them from carrying out their daily reconnaissance missions. Had the Japanese ever sighted the expedition, especially at the start or finish of the operation, the outcome might have been entirely different. At midnight that day, the carriers Saratoga, Enterprise and Wasp would arrive just south of Guadalcanal Island. Task Force 62, the amphibious force commanded by Rear ADM. Richard K. Turner included Fleet Marine Force formations consisting of 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, 15 destroyers, 13 attack transports, 6 attack cargo ships, 4 destroyer transports, and 5 minesweepers. Turner divided his forces into 8 groups: Transport Group X, X-ray; Transport Group Y, Yoke; Guadalcanal Fire Support Group; Tulagi Fire Support Group; Minesweeper Group; Screening Group; Air Support Group; Landing Force Group, which consisted of the 1st Marine Division reinforced. Transport Group X, assigned to the Guadalcanal landing, consisted of 4 transport divisions. 2 of the divisions were composed of 3 transports and 1 cargo ship each. The 3rd was made up of 2 transports and 1 cargo ship, while the 4th had 1 transport and 3 cargo ships. Transport Group Y, assigned to the landings in the Tulagi area, consisted of 2 transport divisions, one with 4 transports and the other with 4 destroyers previously converted to troop transports, APAs. 4 more ships, the Zelin and the Betelgeuse, AK-28, and their escorting destroyers, transported the 3rd Defence Battalion from Pearl Harbor. The Guadalcanal Fire Support Group consisted of 3 fire sections composed of 1 heavy cruiser and 2 sections of 2 destroyers each. The Tulagi Fire Support Group consisted of 1 light anti-aircraft cruiser, 2 destroyers, and 5 minesweepers. The Screening Group included 3 Australian cruisers, 1 US heavy cruiser, 9 destroyers, 2 fighter squadrons based on aircraft carriers, and 8 observation seaplanes on the cruisers. The Air Support Group was made up of 1 fighter and 1 dive bomber squadron, with 1 additional fighter and 1 additional dive bomber squadron for the initial mission, all drawn from the carriers. The men of the 2nd Marine Regiment had the honour of being the first members of their brotherhood to land on Solomon's soil. The 1st Battalion, 2nd Marines, 1/2, inaugurated Plan U by assigning 3 companies to land on one island at 2 different points, where they would be in a position to protect their comrades engaging the enemy on Tulagi and Gavutu. The battalion was to be split for the Florida Island landing, with Company B landing at Haleta and Companies A and C going ashore on the Halavo Peninsula. The battalion was briefed that it was to remain in Florida no longer than 36 hours. If all went according to plan, the 2nd Marine Regiment would re-embark for the apricot operation at Ndeni. The recon party was still on Travanian Island. At this stage, the 1st Battalion, 2nd Marines, would be either a reserve for the operations in the Tulagi area or the primary invasion force at Ndeni. The 1st Raider Battalion was to assault Tulagi Island alongside the 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines, and an artillery detachment from the 11th Marines. 4 hours after the raiders were ashore, the 1st Parachute Battalion would hit the beach on Gavutu, some 2 miles away. At dawn on August 7th, the reinforced 2nd Marine Regiment was poised to wrest the 1st Solomon Islands foothold back from Japan. On D-Day, at 0613, the morning was clear and the usual rainfall was missing. The project was feasible only in the absence of effective opposition from the Imperial Navy. The former San Diego Marines were now on their way to destiny, an apprehensive group of young, untried mud Marines mixed with a few old China hands, plus a couple of Marines who had been in the War to End All Wars over a quarter-century earlier. Some were so green they were called moulded Marines. They were simply told to obey orders. Some in the landing crafts were Mustangs, who had once served elbow to elbow with the enlisted men. There were 2nd Lieutenant Shavetails and other reserve officers called up for active duty, plus a few aged regulars who had been around since the old 1st or 2nd Brigades. However, few on that day in 1942 knew jungle warfare or war in the tropics. They held only vague notions of the enemy and the composition of their target. Until final details were provided, the target name was merely given as Hokompokombolio, a code name dreamed up by one of the briefing officers. Before the day was over, the U.S. Marines, much to their surprise, would be running about seeking an unseen enemy. One Marine with the intelligence section reported that they had been told they were going to attack Florida. His reaction: "What's Florida?" From May through early August of 1942, the air war in the Solomon Islands centered on a bombing campaign by RAAF Catalinas and USAAF flying fortresses against Japanese positions on Tulagi and Guadalcanal. It was an exercise in waste. The crews had to fly hundreds of miles to reach their targets and were frequently hampered by unpredictable weather. In all, they dropped only a few hundred bombs. From a high altitude, most missed their targets. The Allies paid a significant price, for there is no doubt that more Allied airmen lost their lives in this endeavour than did the Japanese. The military significance of the Southern Solomons was not appreciated until after the Kura 3rd SNLF invaded Tulagi on May 3rd. Flight engineer Jack Riddell recalled, "Even through the haze, we could see our old RAAF base that the Japanese had occupied, and wished that we bothered them as much as they troubled us in the 60 raids they made on our AOB." On May 17th, a B-17 from the Port Moresby-based USAAF 19th Bombardment Group flew a daylight mission to photograph Japanese-held Tulagi, and on May 29th, the peaceful nights of the sea infantrymen changed. The RAAF Catalinas had added Tulagi, Gavutu, Tanambogo, and diminutive Macambo to their target list. That day, they were able to dispatch 5 Catalinas for operations in the Solomons, loaded with either 16 250-pound bombs or 8 500-pounders, aircraft from Havana Harbour on F8 Island in the New Hebrides, from Noumea on New Caledonia, and from Bowen Air Base at Queensland, Australia. Unless they were being bombed by a B-17 flying at 14,000 feet, the Japanese generally could identify which aircraft was overhead by the sound of its engines. The Flying Fortress, with its 4 Wright Cyclone engines, had a roar like no other airplane. The Catalina, which was equipped with 2 Pratt and Whitney 14-cylinder power plants, had a different sound. Just after noon on June 13th, Guadalcanal coast watcher Martin Clemens heard a large plane pass over his station. The sound of its engines was new to us. We began to hope that it was a B-17. We heard bombs being dropped in Tulagi, and then the plane, in the distance, returning to the south. 3 days later, another aircraft created a flurry of excitement among Clemens and his crew. At 1100, a flying fortress, returning from Tulagi, flew directly over the station. She really impressed the locals. 40 minutes later, she was still majestically cruising about, when the hum of a Kawanishi was heard. Excitement grew at the prospect of an aerial battle. The Kawanishi suddenly banked to port, turned, and shot upward into the clouds. Our plane appeared to see it. She came roaring in from the seaward and sailed over. The fortress appeared tremendous, and as she swung back out to sea, the air was filled with leaves sucked off the top of the trees. Then she flew around several times in a wide circle. While she was over Ngala, we could hear the Kawanishi treading air in the cloud. Just after 1200, the B-17 gave up the game and flew off. About 5 minutes later, the Kawanishi sneaked out of the cloud, and after a cautious look around, chuffed off sheepishly toward Tulagi. He must have been quite scared. The fortress was cheered to the echo every time she went over the station. In his diary, SME Tomisaburo Hirai of the 5th Platoon, 3rd Company, Kure 3rd SNLF, kept a more accountant-like record of the bombings of Tulagi and Gavutu and of the damage they inflicted. On May 28th, Hirai recorded a bombing at 1935, 4 men slightly wounded. On June 29th, he wrote, 2130 dropped 3 bombs on Tulagi and hit the coast, 10 feet from shelter, yet most hit the sea. At 1445, suddenly someone shouted Kushu Keiho, air raid. They dropped 5 bombs on the Azumasan Maru about 150 meters away, no damage, and flew off. Sometimes the Japanese counterattacked these raids, sometimes not. On the 7th of July, Hirai had recorded 0400 raid on Guadalcanal, no 0 counterattacked. On the 10th of July, however, he noted 1120 a B-17 was hit and downed by a 0. Hirai's reports of the results of the engagements are hauntingly terse. 1200 2 zeros took off, at 1300 only 1 returned, 1032 B-17S, 4 zeros took off, 3 zeros, Type A 6M2, 0 float planes, roofs returned. After a bombing raid on the 29th of July, Captain Kane Monzen, the Guadalcanal base commander and CO of the 11th CU, reported that 1 sailor fireman, Kenkichi Shishikura, was injured at 0430 on Tulagi and later died. The cause of death was listed as Tobu Bakudan Hahenso, appears to be a bomb fragment to the head. The Japanese reported few casualties. Another danger to Allied bombers, in addition to the zeros, was friendly fire, as RAAF Captain Mike Seymour and co-pilot Sergeant Jack Brammell of No. 11 Squadron discovered on the 27th of June while returning from a bombing mission in Catalina, at 24:17. The morning of June 25th we flew to Noumea, where we refueled, armed and departed that afternoon for Tulagi, a 17-hour round trip involving a midnight attack, and returned to Havana Harbour about 0800 hours the following morning. The raid was successful. Fires were seen burning as we left. The return was without incident until, with the harbour in sight and on descent about 10 miles out, we were attacked by an American Wildcat aircraft from VMF 212 from a nearby fighter base, Bower Field. This aircraft was flying a standard patrol north of Havana Harbour. It had not been informed of our presence and had sighted from above a large camouflaged aircraft approaching the flying boat base with red roundels on its wings. We were subjected to 3 diving attacks from vertically overhead. Most of the 50 caliber rounds passed us, but there were some hits on each pass. Both fuel tanks were holed, the port aileron was shot away, the hull was holed in 7 or 8 places, and the wings in about 20. The attack finally was broken off when Captain Seymour did not return fire, though his crew certainly wanted to. He lowered the floats, rocked his wings, and gave the recognition signal on an Aldis lamp. His cat was subsequently patched up and flown to Noumea, where final repairs were made by the seaplane tender Curtis. Seymour flew a 2417 back to Havana Harbour on the 3rd of July, rearmed, and again struck Tulagi en route to the home base at Bowen. how a US fighter pilot could confuse an RAAF Catalina, whose configuration was identical to that of a US Navy PBY, with a Japanese Kawanishi H-6K seaplane is difficult to comprehend. Happily, Seymour and his men lived to tell the tale. The Allied planes were not just bombing, however, they were also carrying out reconnaissance photography, including flights on the 29th of May and the 23rd of July. In fact, this reconnaissance work would be perhaps the greatest contribution of the B-17S that later joined the bombing missions. At about this time, the US Navy entered into the bombing of the southern Solomon Islands, when 3 PBYs from Patrol Squadron 71, 71P-10, 71P-11 and 71P-12, departed Noumea Harbour at 23:20 on the 29th of May 1942. Approaching Gavutu at about 12,000 feet, the PBYs made a normal bombing run, dropping 12 500-pound eggs on the target area. After releasing their load, they climbed to 20,000 feet and headed back to Noumea. They ran into a storm there, however, and trouble began. As the dark clouds descended, the PBYs continued as a trio for a short period. The trio became a pair, then finally each plane was on its own. Somehow they could not raise anyone on the radio, and thus they flew until they were almost out of fuel. PBYs 71P-10 and 71P-11 landed at sea amid 7 to 8 foot waves, but Lady Luck was on board, for they at last were able to transmit their approximate location with their Mayday distress signal before heading to the waves below. At dawn, sister aircraft 71P-1 arrived and maintained a vigil over the downed PBYs. She was later relieved by 71P-7, which flew cover during the night. The crews were rescued 30 hours later by the destroyer Meredith, DD 726. PBY 71P-11 could not be salvaged, and the Meredith had to sink her. However, 71P-12 reached Mare Island in the Loyalty Islands, part of the New Caledonia colony. The PBYs claimed to have inflicted significant damage. VP-71's Squadron Intelligence Report noted, Gavutu damaged. Results, large fires in vicinity of docks and buildings, estimated. Many oil tanks and buildings destroyed, and if any ships present, they were at least damaged. Seaman Hirai, however, reported less damage. Warehouse burned where we stored the Churchill clothes, plus furniture. I stayed 45 minutes, burned till the next day. The Churchill clothes belonged to the former residents of Tulagi Island. The Kura 3rd sailors had cleaned out all the houses for use as their barracks and had placed clothing and furniture in a vacant local building. When the PBYs hit the storage area, the accumulated pile was set afire and belched black smoke as it burned. If ever there was a tried, tired and taxed air group in the U.S. Army Air Forces, it was the SWPA-based 19th Bombardment Group, 14th, 28th, 30th, 93rd, and 435th Bombardment Squadrons. As part of the Far East Air Force, FEAF, this group had fought its way all through the Philippines with wearied B-17S and spent weeks on Java at a forward airfield trying to forestall the Japanese Imperial Army. It continued to bomb the Japanese on dozens of islands. On the 5th of February 1942, the FEF was renamed the 5th Air Force, and its aircraft, though not in great condition, continued to hammer the enemy whenever a mission was ordered. In May, B-17S from the 435th Bombardment Squadron initiated attacks against Tulagi and the other small islands in Tulagi Harbour. On the 15th of July, the 19th Bomb Group, BG, was designated as the Mobile Air Task Force for the Southwest Pacific, which included the British Solomon Islands. At the same time, the Hawaii-based 7th Air Force was named as the Air Task Force for the Central Pacific area. The B-17S of the 19th BG, along with the PBYs of VP-71 and the RAAF Cats, formed the backbone of the Allied airstrike forces in the southern Solomons until late July, when the USAAF 11th BG assumed the responsibility for the bombing of Guadalcanal and the satellite islands. The airstrikes against the southern Solomons were being carried out principally by the command from Australia, the US SWPA group, including the RAAF. Occasionally, US Navy PBYs from the Patrol Squadron Base at Ile Nou, New Caledonia, were involved. To remove jurisdictional uncertainties between the Southwest, SWPA, and South Pacific, SOPAC, areas, the boundary lines were moved westward to the 159th meridian as of the 1st of August. This placed all of the Southern Solomons under the direct control of the South Pacific Commander, COMSOPAC, at Noumea. To support the bombing effort and prepare for Operation Watchtower, the 11th Bombardment Group moved from its home base in Hawaii to the South Pacific, with the air echelons staging down in their planes and the rear echelons following by ship. The 431st Bombardment Squadron went to Nandi, Fiji. Other elements went to the New Hebrides, part of 11th BG Headquarters, and the 98th Bombardment Squadron to Espiritu Santo, the remainder of 11th BG Headquarters, and the 26th Bombardment Squadron to F8. On the 22nd of July, the 42nd and 69th Bombardment Squadrons reached Plains des Gaiacs, New Caledonia. The 11th Bomb Group's ground echelon reached Suva, Fiji on the 2nd of August and arrived at Efate Island 3 days later. The airfield nearest to Guadalcanal, 558 miles to the southeast, was a primitive landing strip at Espiritu Santo, New Hebrides. The island lies on a north-south axis and is about 75 miles long and 75 miles wide, with its main portion and 2 peninsulas extending northward, one on each side. A new 500-foot airstrip was to be hacked out of raw jungle and felled coconut groves, with a completion deadline of the 29th of July 1942. Through backbreaking manpower under the most primitive conditions, the enlarged makeshift airfield was finished on time. Downed coconut trees and stumps lined the edge of the 200-foot-wide strip. The overriding problem, however, was servicing the aircraft with the several thousand gallons of avgas required to fill the tanks of one B-17. The 11th BG had brought with them to the South Pacific a few essential crew chiefs and a couple of mechanics, but the B-17S were plagued by engine failures. The Espiritu Santo base involved inescapable drudgery, and flying to a target area was worse. Between Espiritu Santo and Guadalcanal Island, the 11th BG was forced to fly above 17,000 feet to get over the muddy cloud cover. Some flew at lower altitudes below the clouds, risking a downdraft that could toss a B-17 into the sea. The magnificent group of airmen survived endless hardships and faced countless challenges, yet they received little credit for their effort. Some of the history of the 11th BG was recounted by the group's commander, Colonel Laverne G. Blondie Saunders. I got the 11th in January of 1942. I had no information on any of the islands down there or what their background was. We had to just go with our airplanes and a few administration people and a few mechanics. Our ground echelon didn't get down. I got hold of Admiral McCain at Noumea and asked him, "What am I going to do with bases?" He said, "Well, you go up to Vila Field on Efate, see what they can do there." I looked at the map and got in a B-17, flying it up there. The airstrip was a single strip. He said there was a Marine fighter squadron. This major came out, and I told him who I was and that Admiral McCain had sent me. "I want to see if I can get a squadron up here, 9 B-17S, but we have no ground equipment, just air crews." He responded, "Well, let's take a look." He had tentage, but said, "We couldn't feed everybody at once." I told him, "Well, we can stagger them," and went back to tell Admiral McCain. I said, "How about the rest of them?" He said, "Well, Espiritu Santo is about 150 miles north of Efate. Why don't you go up there and see what's happening? There's a naval detachment, a construction detachment, and a little company of army engineers. See what they have." I took a B-17 with 2 Bombay tanks in it and went up. I circled the field. They had a strip down there. They'd knocked the coconut trees down. It was all coral, of course. I landed and taxied up in a little place they had chewed out. I told them what my problem was, and they said, "Well, we have nothing up here. There's no gasoline, no bombs, no service, no nothing." Saunders had flown from Efate to Espiritu Santo in a B-17F, piloted by Major Alan J. Seward, Colorado of the 26th Bomb Squadron. The field where Seward set his plane down was just a plain expanse on that sweltering day, the 30th of July. No Army Air Forces veteran who served on Santo in late 1942 would have called this incomplete, primitive, unfinished landing area an airstrip. It was surrounded by dense green jungle, populated by coal-black people who, as recently as the turn of the century, had enjoyed eating long pig. The story of Espiritu Santo Button began on the 27th of April 1942, when a Grumman JF-25 Duck, piloted by Marine Sergeant Volley from Efate, landed in Segond Channel, Espiritu Santo Island, with Brig General William R. Rose, USA. Rose commanded the Efate Detachment, Detachment A, of Army Task Force, ATF, 6814. He had been on New Caledonia, but Major General Alexander M. Patch, Jr., commander of ATF 6814, did not want another buck general around, so he shipped Rose off to the New Hebrides. His assignment was to canvass the Luganville area of Santo as a possible site for an airstrip. Espiritu Santo is the largest island in the New Hebrides, and the remaining European settlers were concentrated in the south and east, adjacent to Segond Channel. Luganville was a simple government outpost, with a Catholic mission station and hospital and a handful of European and Chinese stores. At the suggestion of Burns Philp's branch manager on Efate, General Rose met with Tom Harris, the manager of the BP store on Espiritu Santo. They discussed the possibility of arranging a site for a future airstrip. The company had been doing business in the New Hebrides before 1900, and the BP people knew all the locales. General Rose returned on the 12th of May, and Harris introduced him to Pascal Michel, a plantation operator at the time. Michel, Harris, and Rose visited some sites, one of which was the Bencula plantation at Paliculo, then operated by Michel under lease from its owners, Société des Îles du Pacifique, whose headquarters were at Noumea. 2 days later, 3 officers visited the Bencula site, Lieutenant Kenneth Tonking of the Royal Australian Navy, and 2 Americans, one of whom was Army Captain Richie Garrison, Assistant Intelligence Officer, G2, at Efat, 3 Island Command. As they looked over the Bencula location, the first naval station was essentially established on Espiritu Santo when 2 Kingfishers, OS-2U-3, piloted by ENs. Roger S.C. Walcott, USNR, and ENs. Raymond N. Traynor, USNR, of VS-5D-14, flew from Efat and anchored in Segond Channel near Alhena Landing. The pilot's barracks were to be in Tom Harris's house. An interesting reminiscence was provided by Dr. Arthur G. King, who was with the medical section of Army Task Force 6814 that flew from Noumea to Espiritu Santo. My first visit to Santo was in June 1942, with several other staff officers to inspect the situation. A battered PBY-4 flew us in, and I was seated in the starboard machine gun blister, getting sicker by the minute. We landed in a pouring rain, and my first view of the island was a shack near the water to which we ran for shelter. To the right of it was a heap of old whiskey bottles, at least 150 I would estimate. A grizzled, unkempt, but actually pleasant man who introduced himself as Tom Harris greeted us. All that was missing was Sadie Thompson to complete the perfect tableau of the South Pacific. On the 28th of June, General Rose's Detachment A, ATF 6814, along with 9 VS-5D-14 air maintenance men, arrived at Segond Channel on board the New Zealand warship Leander, escorted by 3 destroyers. U.S. Army Detachment A consisted of members of Companies L and M, 182nd Infantry Regiment, part of Headquarters Company, 3rd Battalion, 182nd Infantry, Company B, 57th Engineer Combat Battalion, Lieutenant H.V. Elliott, and a small medical unit from the 182nd Infantry. On the 1st of July, a lease was initiated and signed by representatives of the U.S. Army, the owners of Bencula Plantation, and Pascal Michel, the leaseholder. The property involved 1,700 hectares, approximately 4,200 acres, including 85 hectares, 210 acres of coconut trees, and 67 hectares, 166 acres of cocoa trees. The balance was raw jungle. The United States secured 3 leases for a monthly rental of $1,400. 5 days later, on the 6th of July, 3 officers, Lieutenant H.V. Elliott, USA, 57th Combat Engineers, Major Harold W. Bauer, USMC Colorado, VMF 212, Lieutenant Samuel Mathis, 3rd Detachment, 1st Naval Construction Battalion, NCB, informed Michel that they soon would begin cutting 9 lines of coconut, 30 feet between each. Lieutenant Mathis, with construction experience, had been appointed foreman for the Santo Airstrip. On the 7th of July, marking of boundary lines started, and surveying continued until the next day, when the Santo Islanders saw their first bulldozers being unloaded at Paliculo Bay. On the 10th of July, the workforce included Detachment A, ATF 6,814, 50 men from the 3rd Detachment, 1st NCB, 37 men from the 57th Engineer Combat Battalion, USA, and 5 officers and 145 engineers from the Efate-based 4th Marine Defence Battalion. In addition, about 400 islanders were recruited from Molecular. The airstrip was to have an overall length of 4,500 feet. While the bulldozer was knocking down coconut trees, one little native boy could not contain his excitement. He danced around, trying to explain to everybody, "Big fella moto kill 'em coconut done finish." Former Piusit Joseph B. Chin, 182nd Infantry, recalled, "The landing field above Wright's Ranch, Paliculo, was first started by L&M companies along with the engineers. We cut down the coconut trees by hand and with native labour moved them aside. Then, later, the CB's, Construction Battalion, came in with their heavy equipment to finish the landing strip. Through stamina and determination, the composite force completed the arduous task by the 28th of July, a day ahead of schedule. But the airstrip construction project was not without problems. Adverse weather and a problematic native workforce were constant challenges, and everything was primitive. One airman reported that the runways were soft and often flooded. For night or early morning takeoffs to bomb Guadalcanal, the end of the airstrip was indicated by truck headlights. Both sides of the strip were marked off with cans and bottles stuffed with gasoline-soaked rags set ablaze. On the day the work was completed, an AT-6 Texan aircraft from Efate, piloted by Major Bauer with General Rose on board, was the first plane to land on the strip. Later, Bauer would be awarded a posthumous Medal of Honor for air action on Guadalcanal. The days immediately following the 28th were hectic. Bombs and gasoline had to be obtained to continue the assignment. But the initial planning and construction work had been a success. The 11th Bombardment Group, BG, now had a landing space that was the closest base to the target area. The group had 6 B-17S stationed on Espiritu Santo, and though there were no accommodations for the airmen, they slept under the aircraft, along with the island's voracious mosquitoes. Coordinating the B-17S from 4 different airfields hundreds of miles apart in order to launch an attack on Guadalcanal would be a demanding task. The islanders, much like those earlier on Guadalcanal, as reported by Martin Clemens, were astonished when they saw their first flying fortress. For a long time they just stood around gaping and staring, then edged a little closer, finally touching the enormous bird. But after a few weeks they lost interest and would hardly look up when one landed. On the 4th of August, the government-contracted transport Nora Luckenbach arrived at Santo, carrying 3,000 barrels of avgas and 160 drums of aviation lubrication oil. The ship did not unload. Instead, it headed for Efate Island on the 7th of August, arriving on the 8th. Limited quantities of avgas were stored in the Burns-Philp warehouse at Port Vila on Efate, brought there in brilliant red 55-gallon drums aboard small inter-island vessels owned by the native inhabitants. About 50 yards offshore, The drums would be heaved over the side of the vessels. The islanders would push them ahead as they swam them to shore, then roll them up to the beach. The B-17's gas tanks had to be filled by hand. One crew, anxious to get into combat, filled the big reservoirs by bucket brigade, swinging 5-gallon fills from ground to wing. Later, a few handheld billy pumps were borrowed from the Navy, but it was still a difficult job. Each fortress took no fewer than 30 to 35 drums of fuel. It could take a day to top off by hand one of these gas eaters. From late May to late July, RAAF Cats flying from Australia via Port Moresby had carried out airstrikes on the Tulagi-Gavutu area, though the attacks from altitudes of about 10,000 feet and with small bomb loads caused only minor damage. At the end of July, the 11th Bombardment Group, called the Blondie Bombers after their commander, Colonel Blondie Saunders, became the principal heavy bomber component for the South Pacific. On the 31st of July, 9 B-17S of the 26th Bombardment Squadron from Bower Field, Efate Island, augmented by the Santo-based B-17S, struck their target, Guadalcanal, codenamed Orange Airfield by Allied planners. The flight, led by Colonel Saunders, was under the cover of inclement weather. The B-17S spray-bombed the shadowy island with 100 and 500-pound bombs from an altitude of 14,000 feet. Resistance was slight, the AA ineffective, and the Zeros, roofs, at Gavutu, probably without functioning radar, failed to leave the water in time for interception. The bombers came through Mission 1 against Guadalcanal undamaged. On the ground at Guadalcanal, CPO Yasuo Yamamiya, who was assigned to the headquarters of the 11th Construction Unit and was a close associate of the commanding officer, Captain Monzon, recorded the results of the bombing in his diary. Heard whirl, an air raid, felt the vaguely uncanny sound of dropping bombs, just for a moment, very clear. Lay flat on the ground, exploded with a pillar of fire, hit the Hells Island storehouse, the former headquarters building. 2 labourers were killed, and 2 or 3 men were seriously wounded. Regretfully, grind my teeth with annoyance. Yesterday we had just completed a telephone line between headquarters, the garage, and community kitchen. Now some lines were torn up. KIA were a civilian attached to the Navy, Mr. Kenkichi Shishikura, and another. We buried them in an area surrounded by coconut trees, Lever's plantations. Platoon leader W.O. Sashihata, who said present arms, led a burial service. Let us pray for their souls. We would meet everybody in the home of Kudan. On the 1st of August, another raid occurred. 10 B-17S of the 11th BG struck Japanese bases near Tulagi, destroying 1 patrol plane and damaging another. The bombing ignited fires in the Tulagi Golf Club building, and 4 500-pounders were dropped on the Longa airstrip. 2 Zero floatplane fighters attempting to intercept were shot down. Yamamiya noted, 0900 enemy planes attack while flying over our head. Then they drop about 30 bombs, hit the former headquarters and the coast outpost. 2 men wounded. Afternoon, again another air raid, but heard some firing from Tulagi, but results remain unknown. In the night it was quiet, maybe enemy enjoy a dance on Saturday night. Similar attacks were made through the 5th of August. There was no raid on the 6th. Judging by the small number of bombs dropped, it appears that most of the B-17S did not find their mark, possibly because Tulagi-Guadalcanal was such a small target area. There could not have been heavy anti-aircraft fire, because Lieutenant Endo's 81st Guard unit on Guadalcanal did not have experienced gunners, and not all their guns were operational. In a letter dated the 1st of August, P.O. Tadakuni of the 81st GU turned aside from what he could not talk about for security reasons, the war itself, to tell a correspondent back in Tokyo about the coconuts, cannibals, and crocodiles. However, SM Shizuko Takahashi, Security Force, 11th CU, vividly described his feelings of helplessness in the face of the bombings. This time I think it is truly hopeless when I watch them over our head. Our forces are shooting more and more at the enemy. However, not one bullet seems to hit anything. The enemy circles around calmly over our heads and drops the bombs. If our planes appear, the enemy will immediately flee. Thus, I hope the combat planes arrive here as soon as possible. It is very regrettable because we do not have any weapons for fighting against the air. Thus, the only thing we can do is hide. The time they usually appear is around 0910 to 0930. I wonder if there is a good method of preventing it. 4 enemy planes assaulted us at 0900. No casualties. 5 enemy planes dropped approximately 20 bombs at 1100. Around 1200 there was an air assault for the third time. However, there were no losses. Approximately 20 bombs were dropped in the vicinity of our tent, but fortunately there was no damage. I do not feel as though I'm alive for hiding out. Our combat planes cannot get close to the enemy flying fortresses. It is very regrettable. However, the only option is for us to flee from being killed. SM Norio Ogihara, Command Platoon, 3rd Company, Kure 3rd SNLF, reported, American reconnaissance planes appeared over Tulagi 2 or 3 times a week. Bombings most commonly took place during the day between 11 and 12 in the morning. From July 31st through August 5th, Tulagi was bombed every day. My platoon took shelter, but one man of their number who was on observation watch was killed. The bombs damaged the motor park north of the underpass, hit the cook shack, and struck an ammunition dump near the parade grounds. Back at Palakilo Field on Espiritu Santo, Colonel Saunders was unhappy with the bombing results of the 11th Group on Guadalcanal. He thought the famed secret Norden bomb sites were off-kilter and wanted them adjusted. He asked the engineering officer, Lieutenant Elliott, to have his men construct a perfectly flat 5 by 7 foot concrete slab next to the airstrip so that the ordnance specialists could adjust the bomb site. Whenever one was out of its fittings, armed guards were posted. The adjustments, however, did not help. Although subsequent bombing caused some damage to the Guadalcanal airfield, the results were far less than expected. Yasuo Yamamiya's diary notes, even though 3 enemy planes assaulted at 0900, the bombs only dropped at the working place and barely missed the runway and hangar. However, there was no damage. Even the accurate enemy fortunately did not drop bombs in the vicinity of our tents, thus everybody was overjoyed at being safe. On that day, the 4th of August, was ill-fated for B-1741, 9,218 from the 26th Bomb Squadron, and for First Lieutenant Rush E. MacDonald and his crew. They were on the 3rd raid, which took place between 10:30 and 1200. The 3 B-17s were flying fast from the northwest over Tulagi and Gavutu at between 16,000 and 19,000 feet. All their bombs had found nothing but the ocean. 7 Type 2 Zero-Sen float fighters from Florida Island, 110 Hells Islands, led by Lieutenant Cedar Richiro Sato, attacked the 3 B-17s with 20mm cannon and 7.7mm gunfire, apparently with little effect. Then 1 float plane, flown by 19-year-old NAP-1C Shigeto Kobayashi, singled out Lieutenant MacDonald's flying fortress. He attacked from the rear to the upper right side and rammed it. The disabled fort began pouring out white smoke, then black. The Japanese on the ground knew the fortress was in trouble, and their own pilot surely lost. The remaining 2 B-17s flew off, and 6 remaining Zero-Sen returned to Halavo. The security boat from Tulagi took off and raced to the spot where the Zero was last seen, but they found mere bits of the plane. The only things recovered from MacDonald's B-17 were a helmet, a chest jacket, and a piece of clothing. Participating in that raid was 2nd Lieutenant Jack Lee, USAAF. He spent the night at Espiritu Santo and then took off at daylight to bomb Tulagi. MacDonald and Hurd, John A. Hurd Jr. had damaged H-4 prop the night before on a barrel near the runway. The 3 ships took off, and MacDonald and Hurd were to turn back if the engine vibrated. Over Tulagi, 7 float-type Zeros were waiting for them. They worked around for a frontal attack and made their first try before the bomb run. 2 of the first group of 3 dived and cut loose with their guns in turn. The third was killed in his dive by the top turret gunner. He came between the lead ship and MacDonald on the right wing. He was in a vertical bank, and his top or right wing hit MacDonald's ship between the two left-hand engines. The Zero exploded and blew the wing off the B-17. I turned in my seat to watch the Zero as it went by and saw the crash. There was a terrific flame from the burning gasoline. The B-17 turned on its side with the stub up, then nosed down and fell out of sight. The gunner said that 4 Zeros were shot down. They continued to make passes as we dropped our bombs and turned down to the coast of Guadalcanal toward home. A very tough day. An interesting turn of events was discovered to have occurred on the 5th of August, 1942. Captured Japanese documents show that the Gavutu detachment of the Japanese 14th Construction Unit had noted they had captured 2 flyers that day, crewmen. However, nothing further is known. These documents had long been misfiled at the National Archives, placed erroneously in the translated Japanese records regarding Attu and Kiska in the Aleutian Islands. On the 5th of August, SM Shizuko Takahashi with the 11th CU recorded 3 enemy planes assaulted at 0930, 3 enemy planes assaulted at 1040. Few losses were received at petroleum depot, working place, etc., the airfield. Black smoke was rising from the petroleum of the guard unit that was hit by enemy bombs. This is a fearful sight. We were bombed constantly from 0930 to 1400. On the 6th of August, he reported, no attacks. It would be the lull before the storm. SM Norio Ogihara, in his POW interrogation report, stated, that evening, though nothing was said about it among the men, I felt for the first time that the Americans were coming. In support of Operation Watchtower on D-Day, the 7th of August, the B-17S of the 11th Bombardment Group had a number of their aircraft carrying out reconnaissance flights to scan the area for any signs of Japanese forces. Early that morning, the B-17S of the 431st Bombardment Squadron flew from Nandi, Fiji, to Efate, where they refueled, then were airborne for Guadalcanal. Major Marion N. Farr, USAAF commanding officer of the 431st, piloted one plane. His crew included Lieutenant Pate, co-pilot, Lieutenant Warren, navigator, Lieutenant Lair, bombardier, Staff Sergeant McKee, engineer, Sergeant Rogers, gunner, Technician Sergeant Hendricks, radio operator, Staff Sergeant Winey, radar, Technician Sergeant Nelbach, aircraft chief, and Private First Class Decker, tail gunner. Farr's Fortress, a B-17E, is believed to have been shot down by friendly fire, possibly having been mistaken for a 4-engine Japanese flying boat. A tail gunner on another B-17 reported hearing, "We're hit! We're going in!" That was the last message from Farr's craft. It was never found. Farr and his crew were the first members of the U.S. Army to lose their lives in the Guadalcanal campaign. Between the 31st of July and the 6th of August 1942, the 11th BG flew 56 bombing missions and 23 reconnaissance sorties over the Tulagi-Guadalcanal area, losing 1 flying fortress. Farr's plane was lost on D-Day, the 7th of August, as were 2 others, due to mechanical problems or accidents. By the 8th of August, Colonel Saunders, who had begun the Solomons Air War with 26 B-17S, had lost 15% of his strike force, a stiff price to pay for the 11th BG's participation in the early air campaign. In those earliest days of their missions in the Southwest Pacific, it seemed that the B-17S had better success in reconnaissance than in bombing. On bombing surface targets, they had almost a 0 record. Nevertheless, Colonel Saunders believed that the ease of the landings at Guadalcanal and Tulagi was attributable to the destruction his planes had inflicted on the 2 areas, and, conversely, that the heavy opposition encountered on Gavutu was due to the absence of preparatory air attacks. This evaluation, however, appears exaggerated. The 11th BG flew missions and bombed from 14,000 feet, causing minimal damage. General Vandergrift's engineers found the runway on Guadalcanal in a damaged condition, but not badly hurt, and his troops captured an amazing supply of undamaged equipment, useful for completing the field. When on the 8th of August the US Marines reached the Guadalcanal airstrip, they realized that all the bombing efforts by the Allied Air Force had made little difference. The base was almost intact. One historian gave the following assessment of the bombing. Far less satisfactory was the offensive work of the B-17S, which scored hits with less than 1% of their bombs. The reasons for this slender contribution acknowledged by the Army Air Force's historians included the limited number of planes overall, diversions for reconnaissance duties, small bombing formations, aircrew and maintenance crew shortages, adverse weather, inaccurate intelligence, and inadequate facilities. The inability of the Flying Fortress to hit or sink ships represented a profound doctrinal embarrassment to the Army Air Forces, but the B-17 squadrons made a signal contribution through their reconnaissance work. The extraordinary bombing efforts of the RAAF and the air units of the US Navy and Army Air Forces under arduous conditions were not rewarded by the results. Japanese bases in the southern Solomons were not put out of commission. In fact, they were barely scratched. However, the bombing did slow down the Japanese construction of the Guadalcanal airstrip. The enemy should have been more alarmed by the increased bombing tempo of the Allies, a telltale sign that an invasion was imminent. Apparently, the Japanese commanders on Guadalcanal did not heed the warning signs that X-Day was beginning to unfold. On Friday, the 7th of August, 1942, the calculated risk of Operation Watchtower began. The weather that morning was overcast, low-hanging cumulus clouds mixed with a shallow mist. At dawn, a Curtiss SOC Seagull catapulted from the cruiser Astoria, then dropped a flare to signal the start of the attack. At 0614, a cascade of fire was expelled from the guns of the invasion fleet, led by the heavy cruisers HMAS Australia and Quincy, CA-39, bombarding the shoreline of Beach Red, the area chosen for the Guadalcanal landings. The first step on the long road to Tokyo had been taken. The 13th Construction Unit, whose workforce was Korean, was billeted around Kukum, not far from Lunga Point, on the north-central coast of Guadalcanal. The 11th Construction Unit was in the general area of the Levers and Tanaru plantations. The first Allied shell demolished the community kitchen building at Lunga. At about the same time, the Grumman F-4F Wildcats of the Saratoga, U.S. Navy Squadron VF-5, and the Enterprise, U.S. Navy Squadron VF-6, strafed the beach, including the landing site. The stunned workers scrambled. Some ran for the nearest slit trenches. The rest, terrified, fled in all directions. PO2C Sankichi Kaneda of the 81st Guard Unit recalls, "On the 7th of August was the beginning of hell. In the darkness before dawn, the landing force's men and the construction unit's men, who the night before had celebrated with sake the successful completion of the airfield, drinking and singing until midnight, were sunk in slumber. About 0330-0630, I was awakened by the communication man on duty, telling me that the Guadalcanal Defense Unit HQ had telephoned, "Tulagi is being bombed. Take warning." I got right up and, naked except for a loincloth, went down to the beach to relieve myself. While urinating, I looked over toward Tulagi and saw a red-tinged cloud mixed with flames billowing up, gleaming off the water. Then came a loud boom from the direction of the Defense Unit HQ, and, shocked and horrified, I became aware of incoming naval shell fire, and I found myself instinctively running barefoot through clouds of sand and gunpowder smoke, jumping head-first into an air raid shelter. Quicker than I thought, the trench was full of men. Everyone was saying, "It's an enemy strike force, and what if we get a direct hit?" Like a turtle, I eased my head out of the trench to look around. Smoke was rising from the roof of our hutment. It was beginning to burn. Our uniforms and equipment were in there. "What the hell? I'll be left naked," I thought, and then I shouted, "Our weapons! Hurry or they'll burn!" We rushed into the burning hutment and grabbed armfuls of clothing, rugged shoes, helmets, swords and sidearms, canteens, mess kits, and first aid supplies, and dashed back to the air raid shelter. Shell bursts blasted fronds off coconut palms, and others blew holes in the ground. I skirted the holes and reached headquarters. I found the building on fire. Behind the headquarters building was an uncompleted air raid shelter, nothing but a hole with no cover. In the hole were Dakota Seaman Second Class, SM-2C, Okumura, and SM-2C Takami. In the faint light of dawn, the construction units had melted away as each man for himself grabbed up all the provisions he could carry, and then each on his own scattered. Some took off before the enemy landed and fled to the east of the airfield. Since they were heading toward the enemy, many were captured. The fortunate ones were those who fled to the west, where they found coconut groves and adequate water, and so were able to survive. The deadly Allied barrage started at Lunga Point and to the west of Kukum. Palm trees were slashed and debris flung in all directions. The gasoline dump was set on fire, and the tent camp west of the Lunga River, south of Kukum, had shrapnel holes the size of boulders. Salvos from the Australia's main battery struck between Lunga Point and the Tanaru River, while the transport George F. Elliott, AP-13, fired her deck guns at a supposed Japanese encampment. The heavy cruiser Astoria plastered the area east of the Lunga River with her 8-inch guns. Those of her sister ship, the Vincennes, CA-44, blasted the coast east of Beach Red from Lengo Village, Makil, to Tetere. The destroyers Dewey, Hull, DD-350, and Ellet, DD-398, peppered the eastern third of the beach with their 5-inch pea shooters, while the Wilson concentrated on the centre. The burning Japanese fuel dump sent up a cloud of black smoke so concentrated that the spotter planes could not see the targets. Fortunately, the special prize, the 2 600-foot airstrip, remained almost intact, though a 196-foot stretch was still to be completed. 3 aircraft hangars were nearly untouched, and the 4th was only partially damaged. The pre-landing barrage was lifted at 0907. It had smashed foliage, but killed only a few of the Japanese. The big island, occupied by an unknown number of enemy troops, was to be invaded by 11,349 men of the 1st Marine Division. The ground pounders that boarded the waiting LCPs for the Guadalcanal landing were hardly fresh troops. They had been holed up in cramped quarters for days, some for weeks, but their adrenaline was flowing. Navy crewman Ray Whitaker was aboard the transport Barnett, AP-11. Just before dawn, we had a Roman Catholic layperson lead everyone who desired to participate in Mass. He apologized, saying that it should have been done by a priest, but that under the circumstances he was sure no one objected. After regular chow the night before, we would have nothing to eat but sandwiches and coffee until the operation was over. There wasn't much sleep that night. Lights went out. I saw Lieutenant Cedar Joseph G. Pomeroy throw his 4-cell flashlight at a Marine who was lighting up a cigarette in the mess hall. Portholes were not covered. The only lights during a darkened ship are dim red lights that illuminate just enough area for one to see his own way. The approach to the landing area was from the western side of the Solomon Islands up to the northern tip of Guadalcanal. Then a swing was made east, southeast, and finally south, passing between the northern tip of Guadalcanal on our right and Savo Island on the left. General quarters was sounded a couple of hours before dawn. Everything was proceeding smoothly and quietly. Dawn was breaking in the east. The silence was broken with gunfire forward of the Barnett crew members called the Barnett the Barney Maru. One of the line warships had fired on a small boat or ship of some sort, setting it on fire and sinking it. One group of ships with the screening force had broken off and moved to the Tulagi side. About 0600, a line of cruisers and destroyers commenced bombarding the shoreline at Lunga Point, as well as nearby shorelines on both sides. This went on for probably an hour. In the meantime, the landing boats were lowered, heavy rope netting was dropped over both sides to the landing craft, and finally the Marines climbed down. They left behind a huge pile of heavy shoes on the ship's fantail. I suppose they figured one pair would be all they would need. Beach Red had a surprise for the landing force. There was no enemy resistance. Captain Patterson's Company K, 3/5, landed at Alligator Creek to the east of Beach Red, and the young Marines first ashore immediately fell prone onto the sandy shore, pointing their 1903 vintage Springfield rifles at the expected enemy. They met none. The only unfriendly obstacle facing the invaders was an abandoned Type 88 anti-aircraft gun pointed seaward. The Americans then began their pass through the undergrowth and dense jungle, where the only noises they heard were their landing craft pulling away and the occasional screeching of an unfamiliar bird. They quickly recognized that this was not a tropical paradise, but a hot, humid hellhole. The Marines were somewhat stunned that the Japanese did not greet them with blistering fire. Sepal Or J. Marion, L-35, was in the first wave ashore. He wrote, "My sergeant, Henry Klemicki, said, 'Go.' He went over the gunwale, and I followed. Marion manned one of the two old Lewis machine guns, which he began firing about 600 yards out from Beach Red. He halted his fire within 100 yards of land, just as the boat started scraping the gravel. The man with the dubious honour of being the first Marine to set foot on hot acres was PFC James A. Snodgrass, Company K, 3/5. Later, Snodgrass was accidentally shot through the heart by another Marine who was manning a sniper outpost. Companies K and L were on shore within minutes of each other. Close on their heels was Company A, 1st Medical Battalion. Company B was attached to the 11th Marines. In the third wave were a Marine officer, Captain R.O. Hawkins, and two U.S. Navy radiomen, RM-2 C.M. Mulkey and RM-3 C.R.V. Brown. The three-man shore observation party was to establish and maintain communication with the Vincennes. Communications were initially a problem, however. The equipment did not work well in the jungle and was inadequate for the task. Captain Hawkins's party had established contact with the Vincennes, but they were using portable 25-watt transmitter receivers and 100-watt transmitters driven by 400-cycle gasoline generators for both voice and code messages. Nevertheless, once set up, the communication crew was able to report that the landing party had not encountered any Japanese and that the landing was going according to plan, except that the beaches were being swamped with cargo. Headquarters, 1st Marines, Combat Group B, was busy executing Plan Q, the landing on Beach Red. It was followed by the 1st Battalion, 1st Marines, Combat Team 1, which initiated Plan S by landing on Beach Red and then moving inland through the 5th Marines, Combat Group A, under Colonel Leroy P. Hunt. The artillerymen of the 11th Marines came ashore with their 75mm pack howitzers, followed by the regiment's second echelon, the 105mm tube artillery. Accompanying Colonel Hunt as guides were two seasoned former Solomon Islands residents, J. A. Johnstone, known as Butcher, because he had run the butcher shop on pre-war Tulagi, and CHV Viv Hodges, who had managed the Paruru plantation on Guadalcanal. The 50-year-old Colonel Hunt was well familiar with warfare, having fought at Château Thierry in France during the Great War as a member of the old 5th Marine Regiment. He was never without his leather quirt, carried in hand or stuffed into his trouser pocket. At 0935 on the 7th of August, the 3rd Battalion, 1st Marines, came ashore on the left half of the 800-yard landing zone. Following the 1st Battalion, 5th Marines, and the 3rd Battalion, 1st Marines, elements of the 3rd Defence Battalion under Major J.S. O'Halloran disembarked at 1100. The plan was for the Defence Battalion to secure a 1,000-yard strip along the beach, but when they met no opposition, they moved forward, and their beachhead was lengthened. The battalion, however, which was to be the principal air defence unit on the island, was under strength in both men and weapons. Its commanding officer, Colonel Robert H. Pepper, and one detachment were temporarily on Tulagi with 1/3 of the anti-aircraft weapons. The remainder of the battalion's elements on Guadalcanal had landed with only 3.50 caliber machine guns. Division headquarters moved ashore the afternoon of Day 1 and set up near the invasion beach not too distant from the 5th Marines. The command post was established next to the beach near Block 4, a processing shed on Lever's plantation. The division message centre was set up nearby in a tent under a palm tree just south of Beach Red, with the Lunga River to the west. To that point the operation was progressing well, with no evidence of hostile forces other than a stray sniper. It was not until the following day that the 3rd Defence Battalion received its important air defence weapons, when one 90mm anti-aircraft gun was brought ashore by a special barge from the cargo ship Betelgeuse, along with dual 20mm machine guns and a .50 caliber anti-aircraft machine gun on mounts. The 90s and 50s could exact a heavy toll on enemy aircraft. On the afternoon of the 7th, the Division Command Post, CP, was established against a hillside not too far from the airstrip, and the message centre moved to a tent nearby. The Marines were finding their captured island to be miserably hot. The burning sun that morning was the cause of some heat prostration. Progress was slow and tough. The men were fatigued, and the possibility that unseen enemies were lurking in the jungle made them jittery. They often responded to any unrecognized movement by releasing a blast of gunfire. Colonel Hunt's Marines were less than aggressive in reaching their objective. Some of them acted out their tension by shooting at coconuts or a make-believe enemy, much to the displeasure of the 1st Marine Division Commander, General Vandergrift. Complicating things further, their advance was hampered by crude, hand-drawn maps of the north coast of Guadalcanal, which placed almost everything in the wrong perspective. Meanwhile, the engineers had put a temporary bridge upstream on the Tanaru River, using amphibian tractors as pontoons. The 1st Marines crossed the river and turned southwest toward the area called Mount Austin. On the beach, the 1st Battalion, 5th Marines, crossed the mouth of the Tanaru at 13:30 and marched west towards the ILU River. Neither regiment met any Japanese. The 1st Marines progressed slowly as they advanced inland, with battalions echeloned to the left and rear. The only map the regiment had to guide it was vague. The angle of declination between grid and true north was not shown. Had commanders been able to study aerial photographs before the landing, they might have picked easier, natural routes instead of a straight and difficult compass course through the jungle. General Vandergrift could see loftily the crest of Mount Austin in the distance, about 6 miles from the landing site. It was actually a sort of sloped plateau with heavily wooded ridges, hills that were numbered by both the Japanese and the Americans. Early in his career, General Vandergrift had learned that you seek and take the high ground early, but the Americans would not take Mount Austin until 1943. Meanwhile, Lieutenant J.G. Ichizo Hoshino of the Yokohama Air Group was inducted into the air battle of the 7th of August, strictly by accident. According to a POW report some 5 months later, Hoshino was flying his 4-engine Kawanishi flying boat, probably at about 11:30, with a crew of 4 en route to pick up 5 Navy men. Although the POW report states he was going from Rabaul to Tulagi, more likely it was to Gavutu or Tanambogo. He was also delivering 2 petty officers who had been in training in Japan and were returning. Lieutenant Hoshino's luck ran out that day. Because his radio was not working, he did not receive the message that the Americans had landed on Guadalcanal. His seaplane was attacked by a Grumman fighter near Savo Island. The engines were knocked out, and it crashed at sea. Hoshino and his navigator, Fujita, along with the 2 passengers, petty officers Kimata and Takahashi, managed to escape and swam to nearby Savo Island. They remained there until the 1st of September, when the 4 left in a native sailboat for Kolombangara Island in the New Georgia Group. By sundown of the 7th, the 1st Marines were far short of their objective and were ordered to dig in. The regimental commander, Colonel Clifton B. Cates, appears in Guadalcanal campaign photographs as clean-shaven, well-dressed, with clean-pressed pants and polished riding boots. But Cates was no armchair warrior. He was a splendid strategist and a much-decorated combat leader who had fought with the 6th Regiment during World War I. Between the wars, he had bounced around Shanghai with the 4th Marines and had observed the Japanese firsthand. Cates's guide that day on Guadalcanal was F.O.C.V. Widdy, RAAF, who was attached to the 1st Marines for Operation Watchtower. Widdy had been Lever's general manager in the Solomons and was very familiar with the terrain where Cates landed, as it was right in the middle of his former employer's holdings. In fact, he once had an office on the 120 Hells Islands property. With Widdy as guide, Cates's men reached the banks of the Tanaru River just south of the 5th Marine encampment. The 2nd and 3rd Battalions, 1st Marines, had moved landward, and by evening they had reached the outskirts of the airstrip just east of the Lunga River. The 1st Battalion, 1st Marines, held up briefly by snipers, joined them later, and the 3 battalions then camped adjacent to the airfield. The US Navy had promised a radio station as part of the invasion unit, but somewhere along the way this important detail was overlooked, nor were any cryptographic aids brought ashore. For security reasons, notably fear of capture by the enemy, the division's cryptographic material was left with the rear echelon in a secure area. The quiet the Marines were experiencing on landing would soon be disrupted. On receiving news of the Allied attack on Tulagi and Guadalcanal, IJNAF rear ADM, Sadayoshi Yamada, commander of the Rabaul-based 25th Air Flotilla, ordered his naval Sea Eagles to meet the newcomers. At 11:55, just before noon on the 7th of August, 32 Mitsubishi G4M Type 1, Allied codename Betty, high-level bombers from Rabaul flew in between Savo Island and Guadalcanal in 3 perfect flat V formations, headed straight for the transports. At the same time, 24 Mitsubishi A6M Type O, Zero or Zeke, fighters flew cover overhead. All the vessels were underway before the planes appeared, thanks to advance warning by Coast Watcher Jack Reed, who was behind the Japanese lines in northern Bougainville in the hills overlooking Buka Passage. Reed had sighted the bombers heading south, and knowing that the Allies had landed in the Solomons, he passed on the word that the attacking Japanese aircraft were heading in the direction of Guadalcanal. The message was sent to Port Moresby, call letters VIG, decoded and transmitted to the RAAF base at Townsville, Australia, which in turn informed Task Force 62 of the impending raid. This invaluable information no doubt saved many lives. All shipboard anti-aircraft weapons went into action, including machine guns manned by Marines. The Crescent City was credited with dropping 5 attackers in her vicinity, one of them attributed to CPL. Edward S. Stello, a Marine gunner on the transport. A single aircraft flying erratically and in flames had headed directly for the ship, apparently on a death plunge. According to his Silver Star citation, Corporal Stello, with great coolness and accuracy, opened fire, and shortly thereafter the pilot was seen to slump in his seat. The plane went out of control and crashed into the sea about 50 yards from the ship. By his display of coolness, Stello probably saved the Crescent City and her personnel from disaster. The only casualties on the transports were 2 Marines slightly wounded by flying fragments. Charles Hatfield, a member of the Weapons Company, 2nd Marine Regiment, was on the transport President Hayes. On August 7th, we were preparing to land on Tulagi when we came under an air attack from the Japanese. Our platoon furnished anti-aircraft support for the President Hayes. Our .50 cal air-cooled machine gun was mounted in a landing boat midship on the upper deck. We were under attack from Zeros strafing our ship, and things were very hectic with the aircraft flying close enough to read the markings on the Zeros as they zoomed past our ship. Our crew, firing 50s, was about ready to run out of ammunition, so I jumped to the deck to assist in handing up another case. A case of belted shells weighed over 100 pounds, and we had to lift the case to about 7 feet above our heads. A company cook pitched in and helped. Just at that moment, a Zero dived on us. Bullets ricocheted on our position. The cook didn't wait for me to help him lift the case, but with his eyes open wide and bulging so that all you could see were the whites, he lifted the case by himself and threw it to the loader above, then dived under the landing craft. He could never have lifted it up to his chest at any other time. The leathernecks on deck had a front row seat when US Navy F-4F Wildcats trounced the attacking Japanese. By contrast, those Marines in the ship's horribly hot holds were restless, wondering what was going on. Bill Becker of the 1st Military Police Company on the cargo ship Bellatrix, AK-20, came up from below just before the attack. On D-Day, my platoon was part of the unloading detail. I was down in the hold, offloading ammunition, and it was hotter than hell. We were shirtless. In time I'm sweating so bad I am sick. I was brought up on deck to be revived and was given salt tablets by the medic. Just about that time it happened so fast, the Japanese air unit attacked, and they were coming in only a few feet above the water. All guns were firing at them from our ship, and the other transports were firing too. It is a wonder they didn't hit the other vessels. The sky contest lasted just 11 minutes. The Americans claimed 11 Bettys and 5 Zeros. The Japanese declared only 2 aircraft lost and claimed to have shot down 43 US planes. The destroyer Jarvis, DD 393, had been hit in the action, and the transport George F. Elliot had suffered minor damage. The Elliot's crew continued to unload cargo far into the night, and stopped only when the beach assembly area became congested. The ship's assigned lighters remained unattended and beached on Guadalcanal. The 703 Marines of the 1st Pioneer Battalion, assigned to handle the cargo, were too few for the Herculean task of clearing the beach. Had the Japanese known this and bombed the supplies, the campaign could have been over in a few weeks. 2 hours after the Japanese midday air attack, and before the anti-aircraft guns of Task Force 61 had cooled off, 9 Aichi D-3A Type 99 dive bombers, codenamed Val, from the 2nd Air Group hit the invasion area. Admiral Yamada had expected the second flight to finish off any crippled Allied warships that the Bettys had failed to send to the bottom. He did not know that the pilots of the Saratoga and Enterprise had taken a big chunk out of his first flight. The second attack fared little better, but in all, 9 Vals, 9 Bettys, and 2 Zeros failed to return. The Americans lost 9 pilots and aircraft. Father Joseph Lamar, the Marist missionary on Buka, described the signs that Yamada's air assault had faltered. On the afternoon of the 7th of August, there was a lot of activity in the air. Japanese planes were returning from the Solomons. A large bomber made a forced landing near Lemon Manu. Half a wing had been cut away by machine gunning. Other planes passed over Hanahan in a hurry, out of formation, and seemed to have the devil on their tails. 5 Zero fighters have been forced down at Buka Passage. The natives related to us how these were riddled with American bullets. Friends on Bougainville sent us the news of the landing of the American Marines on Guadalcanal. An Allied victory. Our hopes soared sky high. On the night of the 6th of August, over the President Jackson loudspeaker, the 2nd Marines communication officer announced that the regiment would disembark on enemy-held Florida Island the next day. The men of the 2nd Marines would be the first Allied troops to strike a counterblow to the Japanese on the 7th of August. The 1st Battalion, 2nd Marines, would be the first to go ashore, led by Company B, commanded by Captain Edgar J. Crane, and supported by 4 7-man squads of the 4th Platoon, Company D, the 1st Battalion's weapons company. The formation would be guided by 27-year-old Platt, Sergeant John H. Bowler Sr., called Grandpa by the younger Marines. At 0640 the morning of the 7th of August, Captain Crane's men climbed down the nets to the rocking wooden-hulled LCPs. They were scheduled to hit the Florida Island beach at 0800, a few hundred yards from Tulagi Island. 20 minutes later, Companies A and C, backed by the balance of Company D, departed the assembly area in 14 landing craft. Their mission? Knock out the seaplane base at Halivo on Florida Island. It turned out to be an uneventful milestone, a landing of the Ringbolt operation, the invasion of Tulagi, that ran like a textbook exercise. But this would be the only mission in that area to fit that description. The rest, Guadalcanal, Gavutu, and Tanambogo, would be bloody and grim. At 0740, H-20 minutes, 20-year-old Clarence Frederick Miller of Duncan, Oklahoma, was in the lead landing craft. He was a scout sniper, a post he had been assigned to by Gunnery Sergeant Emery Noble of Orofino, Idaho. Miller's position was in the bow, so that he could dash off into the jungle as soon as the craft hit the shore. When he and another scout jumped onto land that day, he became the first American to step ashore on an enemy-held island during World War II.